Well, it's good to see you all again this morning, and we're going to continue in our little series that we have going. I've entitled it Prickly Pears. It's after my book. I put this book up not for the class. I think the class all knows about it, but put this up because those who are watching it by our YouTube channel for our Voyagers, the book was written more or less a expression of some of the insights and some of the struggles that Phyllis and I had as I've been going through a few years of a number of medical problems. And out of it, I came out with some thoughts, some stories that I hope would be an encouragement to other people who are going through their own struggles. And what I did is out of these 30 different devotionals in the book, I picked out four subjects because I know from my experience after some 50 years or so of dealing with people and counseling and so forth, I found out that there are four basic feelings, emotions that hit us all after some crisis, whether it's a medical crisis, a relational crisis, or whatever. And these four emotions can play havoc not only with our physical and mental life, but they can really play havoc with our spiritual life, our connection with God and those we love. We can actually see some radical changes in our own life and also in our relationship to other people. Sometimes they can see it a whole lot better than we can. So the first week we talked about the feeling of being anxious. It's one of the most powerful, probably the most powerful of all the different emotional reactions we have to our problems, feeling anxious. And then the second one we talked about is feeling like we're a victim, feeling like, why me? Why is this happening to me? And just being confused about it all. Phyllis and I'll mention just quickly, we read a devotional this morning. I won't tell you who wrote it, but it was one of those devotions that said, well, if you just pray and God's going to answer your prayer and you're going to be all well, well, he's kooky as he can be on that particular one. And I think that's one of the things we have to realize that sometimes these overexcited or somebody trying to overemphasize some spiritual truth can say something that's just not true and causes us to feel like we've done something wrong. We're victims, we're confused. In fact, it might even make us skeptical or doubtful of God or God's activities. And we talked a little about the feeling of being a victim whenever you're going through something hard or your family member. Like it's just not fair. Why me? And if you haven't been able to be here to hear these lessons, I hope that you'll go to our YouTube channel as others have and check that out. But today we're going to deal with one of the most difficult, I think. One of the most difficult emotions or feelings that we all have. It's that feeling of being overwhelmed. When something happens that's a crisis, you just feel overwhelmed. Another word for it is to be all consumed. It's that feeling that we get as if we as Americans call it, the whole world is on our shoulders. Phyllis said to me another good word was to feel suffocated. I remember when I was a young man, a teenager, in fact, as a high school student, I took on the job of being a lifeguard and I worked out on the beach. And in our little neck of the Atlantic Ocean, uh, oftentimes people would come out there, young people and old, get on some kind of a raft and just lie out in the sun in the ocean. And the next thing you know, these currents, we were right near the Everglades port, one of the biggest ports in America. And these currents that would drag you out to sea when you weren't even paying attention. Sometimes people would be swept out into the ocean, and as a lifeguard, I'd see them, and I would blow my whistle and tell them to come in, and they would just not pay attention. Next thing you know, they would panicky, and they would dump in the water, and they would start struggling. Some of them couldn't swim, so they were going under and suffocating, and just about ready to give up. And as they were going up and down out of the water, of course, I was heading out that way to try and rescue them. And when I would get there, I had to go under the water and get around behind them because they were fighting. And oftentimes these people, the biggest problem was they weren't really in any trouble because I was going to easily get a hold of them and drag them in. But they didn't know that. So they were actually causing us both trouble. They're trying to drown me and them too. Their feeling of being drowning and feeling of being out of control was really self-imposed. That's what it means to be overwhelmed, to be consumed with something. It's that feeling that everything's out of control and I'm desperate. I think all of us feel that way at times. Um, I will have to say this. This is one of the things going to make this subject today very difficult to deal with because some people's personality is such that they're easily brought into a state of feeling overwhelmed. Other people, not so much. But the point of it is, we all at times have this feeling, but what are we going to do about it? I'm just thinking, as I looked at the Bible, as I was thinking about all this, just about every key character in the Bible had this feeling. Uh, you think about way back there with Abraham and Sarah. Sarah became overwhelmed in several verses that tell about how when she couldn't have a child and she was getting older, she was just completely distraught and she was overwhelmed with the idea that she was going to be without a child, and it destroyed her relationship and it almost drove her crazy. I think of Moses. Moses said one time to the Lord, he said, I'm trying to lead these people, but they just won't do anything right. And he just almost got to the point and said, Lord, I'm just going to give up on all this. He was just overwhelmed by the idea of all his responsibilities. You could go down the list. All of the great leaders, even people as great as Isaiah. I mean, Phyllis and I are reading Isaiah right now in our daily devotional. And I mean, there was a time when Isaiah, even the great, great, wonderful prophet, foretold all that about Jesus. He got so discouraged that he was ready to just fold up and die. You can think of them over and over again. Some of them, actually, even David, such a great man of God, a man after God's own heart. Even David at one point said, God, I just rather die than stay alive with all this on top of me. He just had so many personal problems, so many guilt feelings, and then all of these rebellious people. What am I saying here? I'm saying it's not unusual. You're not odd if at times you feel overwhelmed, you feel completely consumed. That's not unusual. That's going to happen at times. The question is, how long does that last? The question is there anything you can do about it? And I want to talk to you a little bit about it. And this morning, we're going to have to kind of move through this quickly because there's a lot to cover. But I want to deal basically with three things. One, what does it actually mean? And why is it so harmful to have this feeling of being overwhelmed? These things that actually are self-imposed, self-inflicted feelings. You may not be overwhelmed by other people's view, but you yourself feel it. And I was just, before I go down this road too much, can you just tell me some of the things that maybe not you, but maybe people that you know, family, friends, what are some things that in our day cause us to feel overwhelmed or we just get obsessed with it? Somebody tell me some of the things.
Well, I think sometimes the overwhelming amount of information that we're taking in at any given time.
Absolute. Who else? What's another reason that we just feel overwhelmed?
Well, I think sometimes you feel so helpless when you see others that you love not dealing with the situation, and you're helpless because you're viewed as a dinosaur in the first place, and so it's just it's almost, you feel futile in your attempts to help.
I will say that is my daughter. I know who he's talking about.
Well, really, I was talking about my other daughter.
So we know it's a dot level, yeah, we know the daughters.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. What else?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, Phyllis?
Responsibilities that we take on.
Boy, isn't that the truth?
Bill, I think, for me, walking alongside, a loved one who, is either, who's very ill and, caring a lot about their comfort and then, handling all the medical and the daily business, plus your own, that can be overwhelming sometimes.
Absolutely. Thank you. Most everybody in here have been the patient or been the caretaker of a patient. And you know that I don't think any of us ever anticipated the complicated, long list of things you have to do when you get seriously sick. We just think you go to the doctor, get it fixed, go home, go back to business. But good night, when you think of all the many things, just having a list, trying to keep up with everything can just make you sometimes feel like the whole world is on your shoulders. One of the reasons there's so much, I can tell you from my own experience in counseling and others who are my friends who are therapists, just the complication of life's problems can cause some people either to contemplate suicide or actually take suicide as a rate out. You see, there's something very dangerous. And even if you're not overwhelmed in some things, whether it's children, whether it's money, whether it's relationship or health, no matter what it is, if you get so overwhelmed that you contemplate suicide, but anything you're having, of course, one of the things I'm trying to talk about today is obviously when we get overwhelmed with something, it causes some damage with our relationship to God. In fact, some folks I've found, and I found myself with this, that whenever you get ill, there is a tendency, just think about it. There's a tendency to become so obsessed with our illness, it's the only thing that we think about. You get up in the morning and think about all you've got to do with your illness and the doctors and medicine, all that mess. And then all day it's on your mind, and at night it's on your mind. Every conversation, everybody you talk to wants to know how you're doing. And so here we go. And the next thing you know, you have no conversation and no thought about anything but your illness. It becomes what we would call an obsession. In the biblical language, the word that we're using in modern day of being overwhelmed is the word burden. The burden was you got such a heavy load that you're carrying around, it just feels like you can't carry it anymore. It's more than you can take. That's why we call it overwhelmed or burdened down. Jesus said it this way, when you get that way, come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, or carrying a heavy burden. That means when you are overwhelmed by whatever's going on, I will give you rest. What we're looking for, let me tell you this fact. I'm not one of these guys that exaggerate when it comes to the truth of the gospel. What Jesus is teaching us, and Paul was very honest about this, is that you and I may not completely overcome our sense of being burdened down, overwhelmed sometimes, but there are some things that can help us so that it does not bring ultimate anxiety and stress and tear down our relationship with God. This is a difficult thing because you know what I've discovered? I discovered people oftentimes who are overwhelmed, who feel just completely loaded down, are the people who are the most responsible. People who are the ones who have a schedule, who have a checklist, and who get the work done. They're the responsible people. People who just don't give a rip and let it go and just don't pay their bills, don't do their work. These people have a whole different set of burdens. I have talked to people all during my life of counseling and of trying to advise people, found that there are people who are really wonderful, responsible, the kind of people you turn to, who are sometimes the people who get overloaded the hardest and the most. And they are people who it becomes an obsession. And most of these people, and they may be you, most of the people have no idea why they feel this way. They just blame it on reality. And one of their favorite phrases is, "It is what it is." The burden is just there. There's nothing I can do about it. And I just got to handle it, put it on my checklist. So I want to talk to you about what does it mean, give you a Bible example of someone who was a good person, yet was overloaded. And then I want to talk about some steps you can take to help relieve you of this feeling of being overwhelmed. Let's just talk a little bit about what does it mean? What is being overwhelmed? Being overwhelmed is actually a self-imposed obsession. In other words, two people looking at the same problem, one will say, "It's more than I can handle." The other person would say, "Oh, it's just temporary. It'll be all right." And they go right on. Personality sometimes causes it to happen. The people in psychology have a phrase for it. It's called the Pharisee syndrome. Do you all remember what were the main characteristics of Pharisees? And that's what, Jesus had so much trouble with Pharisees because the Pharisees were the people who themselves were obsessed with religious law. In fact, here I wrote a description of Pharisee syndrome from the psychologist's point of view, and then we'll talk about it from the religious point of view. It says a Pharisee syndrome is the mindset of legalism, having laws above grace. It's a feeling of self-righteousness where I think everything else is less than me. It's a feeling of acting of hypocrisy, where we always are critical, judgmental. The Pharisees were extremely judgmental of everybody else. It's a focusing on rules, outward appearances, and judgmentalism, spiritual pride, and tradition over relationship. I think that's the key of the Pharisee syndrome. The fellows who were Pharisees were more interested in keeping the rule and not breaking the rules than they were of doing having relationship. You remember so many times they got after Jesus because he healed somebody on the Sabbath. He broke the law. And Jesus said, "Don't you even remember what the law is for?" I like what this one guy who was describing, a psychologist who was describing Phariseeism, he said it this way: Phariseeism is judging others according to your checklist, ignoring the purpose of the checklist. Isn't that interesting? I think the point of it is there are layers of being overwhelmed and obsessed like a Pharisee. Sometimes, in fact, I would say most of the times, in the midst of being overwhelmed, we have no room for evaluation. According to a leading psychologist, he said, people who are overwhelmed by their own kind of self-imposed rules are people who cannot see anything past them. People who are seeing themselves as being okay and blaming the whole world. It's a blame game. I'm not here to talk about whether it's somebody else's fault or your fault. That's not the point. Today, we want to look at being overwhelmed as we know that if we're so obsessed with something, we cannot see God working in our midst. We cannot see others' needs, and we cannot see how to make life better because we're so obsessed. One of the challenges Phyllis and I decided to take on when I got so sick but to say we're not going to spend the rest of our life, however long it is, we're not going to spend it totally immersed in medicine. Now, folks, whenever you're really sick, even unto death, that's a big job because there's a lot of responsibilities, a lot of things to do, a lot of time-consuming issues. But being overwhelmed is self-defeated. We must find ways to get some air. We can't stay under the water all the time. We got to come up for some air. I want to use this one question for you before I move on. Does anybody have a thought of what is a modern example of a Pharisee? Anybody come to their mind what that would be? What is a Pharisaical attitude in our day?
Oh, I think in the religious realm, are people who care more about dogma than they do about grace.
Yes, I kind of thought, Roger, you'd have something to say, which is a major theme in your theology, and that is that we become so legalistic that we miss grace, we miss love. But with Jesus, we do remember love always trumped law. For Jesus, relationship always trumped responsibility. For Jesus, what you do with somebody's need is more important than keeping the rules. Jesus was always in trouble because he broke the rules. Here's my point, and that is we cannot see others' needs and God's presence if we stay so obsessed and so focused on our own problems. And there will be times when we need a little break from that to stay sane. This is a big dilemma. I want to say up front as we try and move into the question of how to help in this problem. This is a big problem. And I'm going to tell you some ways I think that can help, not solve, that can help this problem. It's a big dilemma because the Bible is full of, and Jesus is full of this. Responsibilities are important. Doing what you're supposed to do, being obedient, being loyal, taking the hard road. That is a major theme in the life of Jesus. And of course, it's a very major theme throughout the overall Bible. In other words, if you say to yourself, this is my duty, this is what will get the job done, I know that it's important because I remember one time Jesus said it this way, that we should work so hard that we should work as if it was all unto God. In other words, I know Paul put it another way. He said, you ought to work as hard as you can as if it were for the Lord himself. In other words, I remember my major professor used to say, work while it is day, for the night comes when no man can work. That's why Jesus called for excellence. So listen, on the one side, you got Jesus saying, work hard as you can, because this is maybe the last time you get to work. Be responsible. Do what you ought to do. Don't go the easy way. On the other hand, listen to this. He said to us, whenever you're working so hard, remember this, you need to rest. He told his disciples, you all are all worried. Now come and follow me to a quiet place where you can rest. Jesus said, yes, it is important that we are working hard and we're responsible, but at the same time, there's a place for you to go aside, to stop. So here's the problem. How do you know when you're being too responsible and not being relaxed, not being relational, not just trying to be close to people, close to God? When is it more important to stay with your list? The dilemma is impossible to solve. I don't think any of us have a formula to make it right. let's look at one example. This is a really tough example. This is one that has been used so many times, and I'm going to ask Phyllis to read her story. It's the story of Martha. If you remember, Jesus had been in Jerusalem teaching, and he needed a place to stay. Well, one of his favorite places to stay in the area, which was only just a few minutes away, was to stay with Mary and Martha, the two sisters who lived with their brother. And you remember, Jesus often went there. The Bible tells us actually it was Martha's house, and Martha was apparently the one who had the discipline to buy the house, to run the house. She was apparently she was the chief cook. And so when Jesus came there, I'm sure some crowd followed him because it says he was teaching. So probably Jesus was over in the main room where the people were, and he was teaching. And then all of a sudden, Martha came running back in the room, and she got in trouble. Phyllis, read us the story.
Well, first I gotta say something else. You know, this week when Bill's been talking about being overwhelmed, do y'all know there's a word, whelmed? I never heard that word. Whelm is a word. It's a verb that means to turn upside down and submerge and overwhelm. And now we hear the word underwhelmed, which means I'm not so impressed, but overwhelmed. But whelm itself is a word. I'm going to start using that word because it's appropriate sometimes. And then I have a confession. Bill and I have had some really interesting conversations this week about Mary and Martha. My mama should have named me Martha. And it is, as I've seen that expression, I know you have to, it's very difficult. And I know this sounds sexist, but in my generation, where women had certain roles, it's very, very difficult to be Mary in a Martha world. So we had some real interesting conversations this week. This comes from Luke 10, and he asked me to read it in two translations, just 4 verses here. I'm reading now from the New Living Translation. As Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. Her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he taught. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, "Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me." That almost makes you chuckle, doesn't it? But the Lord said to her, "My dear Martha, you are worried and upset over all these details. There's only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and it will not be taken away from her." And then I'm reading these same 4 verses from the Message. As they continued their travel, Jesus entered a village. A woman by the name of Martha welcomed him and made him feel quite at home. She had a sister, Mary, who sat before the Master, hanging on every word he said. But Martha was pulled away by all she had to do in the kitchen. Later, she stepped in, interrupting them. "Master, don't you care that my sister has abandoned the kitchen to me? Tell her to lend me a hand." The Master said, "Martha, dear Martha, you're fussing far too much and getting yourself worked up over nothing. Only one thing is essential, and Mary has chosen it. It's the main course, and it won't be taken from her."
Thank you, Phyllis. It's important that we remember that Jesus drove his biggest points, taught his greatest lessons through stories, not through statements. Our Lord lets the Holy Spirit apply these stories to our own particular needs, so that sometimes the Lord may be speaking to somebody listening to me right now. And your problem of being overwhelmed and what is driving your sense of being overwhelmed and being obsessed to the point you can't hear anything else, your problem may be totally different and probably is totally different. So Jesus uses story to teach some lessons. Do I know exactly what he was trying to say? No. But when you look at the teachers of the Bible over the years, you find out some things that most everybody agree on. And that is one, Martha was not a bad person because she was in the kitchen when Jesus was teaching. Martha was not a self-centered person. If anything, she was totally trying to help other people. Martha was not a sloppy, irreligious person. Martha was a very responsible person. So we're not talking about somebody bad. Everybody agrees Martha was a good, responsible woman who loved Jesus in her own way. But the other side of the story is very obvious. Jesus is trying to teach a great lesson here. One that is difficult to hear when we become defensive of our own things that we do. And that is Jesus and the Pharisees had a hard time hearing Jesus. Why? Because Jesus was saying when he said, Martha, dear Martha, Martha, dear Martha, it's a wonderful thing you're doing, preparing a meal for us and all. But Martha, he used two words in the Greek language that's translated oftentimes worried and upset. You're worried, meaning you're anxious. You've got yourself all stressed out and you're all anxious because you see the crowd, you know they need to get fed. Somebody's got to feed these people. You're all anxious about all this. It's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. You're as the message translated, you're getting yourself all stressed out. And then he used the word upset in the New Living, which is inaccurate. And that word upset means you are overwhelmed. You have burdened yourself down when it's not necessary. It's not necessary. These people are not going to starve to death because they take an hour off to listen to me, but I'm not going to be here but one time for some people. This is the only time they're going to get to hear this. Here's the point Jesus is trying to make. It's not wrong to be responsible. But Mary, I'm going to say this in a sweet way. But what I want you to hear, Jesus is saying, I want you to hear there is a time when you need to stop. Stop being so responsible with your responsibilities and start being responsible to my responsibilities. You need to stop. And he basically let her know she doesn't need to tell him what to do. Remember, he said to her, Martha, Martha, what are you doing here? You're telling me I should tell Mary to get up and leave? You're telling me what I ought to do? Martha, relax. Now, here's the reason it's so difficult. Sometimes our responsibilities are so important, we forget they're not as important as a relationship to the Lord. In other words, some people are so much a workaholic that they have no time to spend with the Lord. Some people are so driven that they cannot possibly see Jesus doing anything. Here's what we're trying to say about being overwhelmed. The Bible example. Jesus' story is telling you today, not if it's just illness, but anything that is so driven in your life that you just don't have time to stop and to try and get closer to him, try and see him in everyday life, then something's wrong. And it's going to damage you, your thinking. It's going to damage your relationship with other people. They're going to see that all you want to do is work hard, make that almighty dollar, carry out your responsibilities, but they don't care anything about them. Is it possible that somebody that you know thinks you don't love them because you're so busy taking care of your own stuff? That's what the Pharisees did. That's what Martha did here. Martha is just an example, not of a bad woman, example of a good woman who got her priorities out of shape. Now, I want to spend most of the time, though, the rest of this time, I want to spend talking about something that's really important. And that is, what is it that we can do about it? In my book, Prickly Pears, I gave a story about a man named Terry Herbert. I'm going to give a quick summary of it. It's the last story in the book. It's about a fella who was a treasure hunter. He used one of those little devices you go around, detects metal, and he went all over England looking for metal because he wanted to find the great treasure. All his life he'd wanted to find a treasure. To make the story short, one day he didn't really have time to go out across the country and look in the most logical places. Instead of looking in the logical places, he just went out basically in his backyard and started looking. And guess what? You know, he found a treasure. And when he invited the university to come look into it, they found a treasure that became the largest treasure find in the history of England, a huge treasure. The moral of that story, which is a true one, is that Terry Herbert found what he'd been looking for all of his life right there in his backyard. But he had missed it because he kept looking for the big find somewhere in some exotic place, somewhere in some fancy place. But he missed it because he walked right by it every day. Here's what I'm trying to say. One of the things about being overwhelmed and obsessed with our problems is we miss finding, seeing God, being close to Him. Isn't that what we want to have? We want to have that kind of a close relationship to our Lord. We want to have what we hear people talk about, hear testimonies of. You want to have that. You want to have that peace when other people have an anxiety. You want to have that sense of God is with me when it seems like you're just overwhelmed by everything else. You want that. Well, how do you get that? One of the things, it's probably not going to happen because you go somewhere. You head off to the hills, head off to Colorado, try and spend a weekend finding God. No, your treasure is probably going to be found right there where you are, right? And you say, well, how do you do that? How do I take just a moment? How do I take just a little time to actually find God in the midst of my feeling overwhelmed? Well, I'm going to give you a few hints, and you'll have to let the Spirit of God speak to you about these things. First of all, I would say you and I need to do what is being, whenever we're overwhelmed, we need to do this. I got off the page here. You don't want to lose your notes. First of all, you need to choose to make what I call an unreasonable choice. You need to do something that goes against your grain, something you think is just not right, something that's illogical, that's uncommon with you. I think the fact that whenever I'm overwhelmed, it doesn't make any sense to me to take some time out and just spend it with the Lord. Do you know how many times I've had people in my some 60 years of ministry? Do you know how many times I've heard people say, I just don't have time for a devotional life. I just have time for doing Bible study. I don't have time to spend talking to people about these things. I'm too busy. Isn't it interesting that if you make this unreasonable, unlogical, illogical decision that I don't care how busy I am, this is what I'm going to do because I need to, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it's irrational, even when people tell me it's not worth the time, it's not going to make any difference. I want to tell you something. It does make a difference. Jesus said it this way: whenever you feel burdened, carrying, as he put it, a heavy burden. In modern psychology, that's called when you feel overwhelmed or obsessed, What'd he say do? He said, come to me. My simple interpretation of come to me means turn aside, get away from what's causing you a burden, break into it. He told his disciples one time, I know you all are stressed out about what's getting ready to happen, but come with me. We're going to a quiet place. And I want you to pray. I want you to talk to the Lord. I want you to talk to your Father. I want you to get close to Him. But I don't have time. We ought to be busy. No, come to me. Relationship to Jesus must be a priority. And you say, well, how do I find that relationship? All I can say is let the Lord speak to you through these words. I've found that way when I'm under a burden by one, talking to Him and listening to Him, not just in a prayer life, but by reading His Word and expecting Him to say something to you special. By listening to a song, a music, someone singing, or have you singing. Phyllis and I try and sing 2 hymns every morning, every verse if we can, to see what does God have to say through these old hymns that's spoken to us all these years. Maybe it's reading a book and God says something to you. Maybe it's talking to a friend, talk to someone who believes like you do. You say, I just don't have time to talk to that person. Take time. Do the unreasonable. Expect God to be in that conversation. And last of all, do what's unreasonable. Choose to look for visitors. Look for a person. You know the word angel? Everybody here knows that the word angel means messenger. But did you know sometimes an angel, a messenger in the Bible, is not some supernatural person? Sometimes an angel in the Bible is somebody who brought a message, a friend, a stranger, a visitor from the church. What am I saying? If you want to make a very difficult choice, I want you to admit, Father, I really feel overburdened, and I'm going to do what you said. I'm going to come to you. And how am I coming to you? I'm going to look for somebody, a visitor, a stranger, a friend, somebody that I think is you giving me a message. Spend some time doing these things. The second thing I want to say that can help, not solve, but help your problem of being overwhelmed is to choose an unreasonable time, not a convenient time, a time that doesn't make sense, a time that you say, well, I need to sleep. No, you don't. You need sleep, but you also need time with God. Find that time that's not convenient. Break away. If it's in the middle of the day, in the night, in the morning, whenever it is, find some unreasonable time when another person would say, that time's too valuable. There is no time to do these things I've just talked about. If you are a busy person, and maybe it's because you got such a long list of medical things, you say, I just don't have any time. Then I would say to you, Martha, come out of the kitchen for a minute. I'm not telling you to never go to the kitchen. I'm telling you to come out. Jesus is here. You need to hear Jesus. And then I want to say a third thing. I think this is critical. And that is you can help your feeling of being overwhelmed by expecting an unreasonable result. The world will tell you doing these things I just talked to you are foolish. They don't make sense. It's not going to happen. I tried it and it didn't happen to me. How long did you try it? How hard did you try it? Did you put as much energy into it as you did your work? I'm asking you to expect an unusual results. In other words, to anticipate that God is going to show up. Anticipate He's going to speak through his word. Look for him in that song. Listen for him and see, isn't he going to show up in a person, somebody you never expected? If you never expect to see anything, if you're another Terry Herbert and you walk right by it just because it's ordinary, because it's everyday stuff, and you're always looking, you're always praying for some spectacular thing to happen out there, you're not going to get it. It's when you look right where you are and you say to God, show me yourself, speak to me. I'm going to end this by saying, Phyllis and I made a decision when we were in the middle of all of our medical problems, probably the most overwhelming, obsessive times when it just looked like when we got up to when we went to bed that we didn't have anything to do but lists on medical things. We decided one time that we were going to start trying to let God show us himself, whether it was in a life of a nurse or a doctor or somebody in the waiting room, or we were going to try and see God. We asked God to show himself wherever we were. Recently, some of you know, we're probably some of the worst when it comes to this having responsibilities, taking them seriously. I mean, Phyllis and I are some of the most predictable people on the face of the earth. We make good Americans. I mean, I mentioned in my book forward about it, Phyllis and I are so predictable. I mean, we brush our teeth at the same time. We wash our face. We eat our food. We take our exercise. I mean, we have a schedule, and brother, if we get off schedule, we get all nervous about it. Well, one of the things we do is that we go to HEB to curbside pickup because we can't mix with the ordinary folks. So we just pick up food on the curbside. Well, you know what? Phyllis sets the time and we get there maybe 7 or 7:30 in the morning because there's not very many people there. And we may be the only car in the parking lot. Well, this week, just a few days ago, we were out there, I don't know, 7:30 in the morning. There was only one other car there. Somebody as nutty as we are. Here comes bopping down the curb with this young boy, looked like a teenager. He came bopping down there to bring our groceries, as it is with Phyllis's custom, because people like her more than me. She speaks to the people. This fella brought our groceries. He opened the trunk, and she turned to him and said, "Well, how is your morning going?" And as we were delighted, he said, "It's going wonderful. I try to always stay positive since I got baptized." Well, that was a clue. Here was one. So Phyllis said, "Oh, that means we're brothers and sisters in Christ." And he said, "That's right." He said, "And ever since I got baptized, I try to stay positive because I'm still trying to figure out what's God going to do? What's my future look like? Where is he going to lead me?" And so Phyllis said to him, "Hey, what do you think he's leading you to?" And he said, "Well, I really like to work with wood. I want to be a," and he went into this long story. And Phyllis and I both encouraged him. And after a while, he was saying, like, "Yeah, I already did my devotional before I came to work." When in the world is this teenager doing a devotional at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the morning? He said, "Oh, I love to do my devotional. I love to read." And she said, "Well, guess what? I've got a present for you." He said, "What?" So Phyllis reached in the back seat and gave him a copy of Prickly Pears, a copy of Devotions for a Healthy Life. And I wrote a little message in it, encouraging him to follow the Lord as he was. And she got it and gave him those books. And he said, "Oh, I really look forward. I love to be in devotional time. I love to read." Friends, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this for two reasons. One, if that boy who has to work delivering groceries at 7 o'clock in the morning can find time to get close to the Lord with all he's got on him, can't we? And I'm telling you this because we decided we're going to look for the Lord and not just let the Lord find us in the midst of our misery. let's take time, folks, to look what the rest of the world says is never going to happen. Let's do the unreasonable thing. Let's look for him. Well, our time is up. I thank you for listening, and I hope the Holy Spirit will use this message today to speak to you in some way that will be helpful to you and to your family. Well,
I'd rather not, but okay. Yeah. Thanks, Bill, as always. I was really looking forward, when we got your email earlier in the week, about today's lesson, and it did not disappoint. I think everyone would agree, with that. So, you know, a lot of us are fans of the series The Chosen. And when you were talking about, forgetting what the law was, you know, if you're familiar with the series, there's a scene, right, where the Pharisees confront Jesus. And they say, you're breaking the law, you know, you're doing it on a Sabbath, you're breaking the law. And Jesus gets in their face and says, I am the law. Okay, you know, and it's such an awesome, it's just like one of those mic drop moments, okay, you know, I guess they have nothing to say. You know, they're like, you know, he says, I am the law, you know, and they're like, oh, now you're really crazy. Now we're really gonna kill you, you know, and stuff. And so Bill, just a multitude of great points this morning. But you know how my mind works. Well, maybe you don't, thankfully. So I was asking, as Phyllis was reading her two versions, I was wondering, because this would really help me personally, Bill, if you know a version where the Bible, where Jesus is having a conversation with Martha, and any version that says, Martha, just calm down. All right, because those words have gotten me in more trouble. You know, with my wives, okay, and my daughters and my mother. Okay, you know, just calm down. I can't find a version of the Bible that says that, so.
What were you doing that everybody had to tell you to say, calm down?
Exactly.
They were making something here.
Yeah, you know, so Phyllis, do you have some advice?
No, I do not. I wish I did. I've always struggled with this passage because like I said, I should have been named Martha. But I love Jesus' response. He didn't tell either one of them what to do. He didn't say, Martha, take off your apron and sit down here and listen to me. He didn't do that. He just said, Martha, you're so upset. He didn't even tell her not to be upset. And he didn't tell Mary to get up and go to the kitchen either. So that says to me a lot about Jesus. But what he did communicate was powerful. And this is the essence of mine and Bill's conversations this week. When Jesus is near, and he's always near, you make time. You make time to be with Jesus. As I love what Eugene Peterson said in the message, she's getting the main course.
Yeah, that really struck me, Phyllis. I'm glad you chose that version, the main course.